Hi there, I'm Jake. Welcome to the Blind Eternities Tavern. Magic the Gathering is an expensive hobby. And with Final Fantasy right around the corner, I expect it's going to get even more pricey. But as the cost of cards continues to go up, people are becoming more and more comfortable using proxies at the table. However, not all proxies are created equal. And I think it's important when we are using and making proxies that we are using and making the right proxies for the right situation. So today I want to talk about the different types of proxies and talk about why and when we should be using them. So pull up a chair and have a seat at the table, and whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful ruffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake. Let's talk games. So before we get into the detail of the different types of proxies and why we use different types of proxies, I think first we need to discuss people being okay with proxies. Because while some people are very positive about using proxies at the table, other people, not so much. And the reality is both of those people are right. Magic the Gathering is a game built on collectibles. It's built on having these cards and building a deck from the cards that you own. Proxies kind of circumvents that. Proxies cuts out the collectible aspects of the game. Proxies allows you to focus on the gameplay and the deck building alone. But the reality is Magic the Gathering does have that collectible aspect, and for the people that really appreciate that, this might not be looked on so fondly. So just bear that in mind if you do decide to add proxies to your deck. Make sure that when you sit down at a table, you make that clear with the other people there. Make sure that everyone is comfortable using proxies. And make sure that the proxies you are using fits the situation that you're in. See, I started playing Magic in 1999, and the first proxy I made was in 2002. And it looked a little something like this. Just the name of the card on a piece of paper. And the reality is, I think this is still the most common type of proxy. Just taking a basic land, throwing a piece of paper in there with the name of another card, and that's enough to play the game. You can always look up the oracle text for the specific cards, and I think typically when people are proxying in this fashion, they act as placeholders. This is usually the most temporary form of proxy. I use these a lot in my modern decks because, as you can see, Breeding Pool is not something that I have an infinite supply of. In fact, I have a playset of them, but they tend to live in commander decks. So in my modern deck, it's a slip of paper. And if I ever go to a modern event, I'll swap those out and make sure that I have all real cards in my deck. These temporary proxies are also really handy if you are trying to see if you like a specific deck or a specific style. The drawbacks here are that having too many of these in play at a time makes it difficult to maintain board state. They don't have the rules text of the card. And I would recommend, if you are able, to make these a little more detailed and upgrade to full card printed proxies. Now these are still on printer paper. It's just the full card printed. And you can slide that in front of a basic land just like anything else. But now you have the entire game state actually visible on cards. Not actual cards, but you get what I mean. With all of the text, all of the power toughness, everything that's active on the table, and it's much easier to keep track of. And I did this in 2005, and there was a reason why I printed the whole card, and that was because I actually made an entire Magic set of custom cards with their own abilities, their own rules, and I built this deck to be balanced against the competitive standard environment at the time. It acted as a good litmus test for new standard decks. playing into a blind competitive format, you could pull out one of these, play a game, and see how it stacks up when you're not playing in the same metagame that typically gets a little bit stale in the local game store. So I like having those printed proxies. They don't have to be fancy, they just need to be playable. Something for you to test the cards out, get a feel for it, goldfish a little bit, and prep yourself for when you go to a real competitive environment. They're useful in casual formats as well, but that tends to be more of a price point aspect than it is a card availability aspect. Cards like Breeding Pool are not crazy expensive in the grand scheme of Magic cards, but having a breeding pool for every deck that has green and blue in it when you're bringing 10 or 12 decks gets a little too expensive. So having some of these simplified proxies just slip into the other spots gives you that flexibility to have a card in more spaces than you have copies of that card. But let's step up a little bit. Talk about slightly more permanent proxies. What do we do when we are proxying cards that we aren't going to be able to get as easily, that we can't just walk down and pick up for a couple bucks at the local game store? How do we design those proxies? So we're building out a new deck. We're pretty happy with the way that it plays. We've used our simplified proxies to verify that we like the way the deck functions and we want to start getting the cards for it. We start on the cheap end, filling out all of the dollar and under cards, populating those slots in the deck. But as we start moving up the line, we realize that we've kind of hit a budgetary issue. And we're going to have to wait a little bit before we actually fill out the top end of that deck. Well, that was where I was at in 2006. I was putting together a kind of fun blue-green control-y deck, and I didn't have access to Force of Will. And with no Force of Will reprints on the horizon, and no easy way to access this card without shelling out a good amount of money, I started making slightly more durable proxies. Now this is a reback of a card. So it's a real Magic card at its core, but the front is replaced with a printer paper copy of Force of Will. Now obviously holding this in my hands, you can feel the texture difference. And looking at the way that it bends and kind of the way that it behaves as a card, you might notice that it's not exactly a real Magic card. But if you put this in a sleeve, it's pretty darn close, and it shuffles into the deck just fine. I firmly believe that these are the single most dangerous proxies that exist, because it's very easy to confuse these proxies for real Magic cards. And if you're at a point where you're going to have a long-term proxy like this, while it's nice to have something that looks like the real card, it can be fairly confusing, and I definitely don't want to find myself in the case where I accidentally trade with somebody else exchanging a proxy for a real card. Because that leaves the proxy line and becomes a counterfeit. We definitely don't want to be making counterfeit cards. And just on a personal level, whenever I make a proxy, I try to make sure that it looks visually distinct from the original card that I am proxying. I want to make sure it has the right text, the name, the mana cost, all the rules stuff is correct. But everything else, artwork, frame, whatever else, tweak it just a little bit so you know it's not a real Magic card. But there's a couple other ways that we can make proxies like that, and a couple other things we can do when we have that sort of long-term proxy that we're trying to fill in our deck. In Ashley's Ob Nixilis Captive Kingpin deck, she runs Pyretic Ritual, but not a real Pyretic Ritual. To be clear, I own copies of Pyretic Ritual. We could easily put one into that deck. But last year at MagicCon, she pulled a copy of Mark Ritual. Now Mark Ritual is a card that costs a black and a colorless and produces black, 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 but if it's signed by Mark Rosewater, all of those black mana symbols become red, and it becomes essentially a pyretic ritual. So we swapped that out for this Mark ritual, and she just runs this in her deck as kind of a proxy for that pyretic ritual. And I think it's really cool to pull this out on the table and be able to play it just as a pyretic ritual. And if anybody were to put up a stink about it, we could swap in a real pyretic ritual for it, no problem. But the other thing we can do when we're building proxies like this is take existing cards and simply remove a little bit of text or add a little bit of text. I had friends that did this a lot with the old Sky Diamond and all of those other cycles of 2 mana cost artifacts that tap for a colored mana and come into play tapped, where they would Sharpie off the comes into play tapped and just draw a 0 over the 2 to create proxy Moxen for vintage tournaments. Similarly, this is my proxy of Lotus Petal here. I used another card I had sitting around where you could kind of mark things off and just keep the part that works for the card. I think in a more modern example, you can use Wheel of Misfortune to create a regular Wheel of Fortune, or a variety of other cards like that that are similar. There's a lot of cards that become balance with just a little bit of tweaking. And if you're going to throw some long-term proxies into your decks, this is a really easy way to do it, by modifying existing Magic cards in a way that lets you just run with that real card in your deck with the text changed to be the thing that you need it to be. But we can go a step further than that. And I think the end of the line for making these proxy cards is doing full custom templating. Building out the card top to bottom exactly to your specifications. And this is what I like to do for all of the long-term proxies that I don't ever see myself owning. A couple good examples of that is my Chains of Mephistopheles from my CEDH deck. I use the Lich art from Adventure Time, and I use the updated Oracle text on the card. If you're going to do all of the steps of going through, of setting up the card, building out the templates, putting in all the right text into the card, make sure that you're just using the real Oracle text so it's easier to read. Gilded Drake gets really confusing unless you have the updated Oracle text on everything. A lot of these older cards are just difficult to follow. So short of adding the flowchart to Chains of Mephistopheles, the updated Oracle text is about as close as you can get. And then I also have this Black Lotus that I built out for a video that I did a year ago talking about how vintage Magic is essentially Yu-Gi-Oh! And if you take the Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck construction rules and apply them to Magic, 40-card deck, 15-card command zone, basically, and a 15-card sideboard, the game of Magic plays a lot like Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think there's a lot of overlap in the way that we use resources when you get down to those highly optimized full vintage lists. So if you have time, I would check it out. But I made this Black Lotus for that video as kind of what a Black Lotus would look like in a Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. But I've actually gone a step further than that, because I've proxied entire decks before. And I think if you are going to go with that step, I like to follow the rules that Magic sets before us, because Magic the Gathering is built on separate planes. If we're going to take the time to lay out an entire set of cards, well, we might as well do that last little bit of legwork to make sure all of the art and the frames and everything feels cohesive, to bring that set into its own independent, customized, separate plane of Magic the Gathering. Now, I've shown my Adventure Time deck on the channel before, and I think that turned out really well. It's an adventure-themed Timur deck, using Paco and Halden as the two commanders, as Jake and Finn from the Adventure Time series. And the entire deck is built using art from the show, and it's all built using the Eldraine frames with the adventure box in the text box, and it's really cohesive and fun. But there's another deck that I put together a little more recently, and this deck I built to be a little more competitive. This is my CEDH Batman deck. And I used entirely art from The Long Halloween. And my commander is Inquisitor Greyfax as the Dark Knight. Now, I built this deck with a few different commanders. They can be swapped in and out, but like any competitive deck, when you change out the commander, there's a lot of cards in the main deck that need to change as well. So while this box is exactly 100 cards of Batman-themed Esper CEDH goodness, when we swap out the commander, some of these are going to have to go. And so when I made this deck, when I templated everything and built out the list, there's actually about 200 cards that I custom built. And so when I swap out the commander, when I tinker with the deck, I can go back and move some new cards in and move some of these old cards out. This allows me to customize the power level of the deck, change the actual goal, and tailor it just a little bit as the CEDH metagame in my local scene shifts. So if I want to move from playing Inquisitor Greyfax, I can move to playing Rafine or Tevet. Tivit? Or a few other Esper commanders that are all really good. I can go Timna Malcolm, I think, is the Esper combo that I use there. But by combining those different commanders and different playstyles in the deck itself, it gives me a ton of flexibility. And so after I've proxied all of these cards and built out the list, I don't have to go back and make new cards every time I want to change it. It's a really handy way to build out that cohesive deck and never needing to swap in other cards. Obviously, this was built more for artistic purposes than financial purposes, but I completely understand proxying Magic cards, not for the style, but because of the price. Because there is probably no way I am ever going to own a real copy of Chains or Lotus. So proxying these out will probably be about as close as I ever come to playing them in my cube or in my CEDH decks. But for a lot of these other cards that I have in this CEDH deck, I have real copies. I could start piecing this together. And in Ashley's Sisay deck, she's already begun that. It's about 60% real cards at this point, starting with almost entirely proxies. And as we get up to those last 15-20 cards, it's entirely possible that those never get replaced. All of the dual lands, all of the fetch lands, some of those higher end cards are a little bit trickier to come by. But if we are building something cohesive, designed to be a standalone deck, I think it's kind of fun to leave it as that unique standalone deck. Plus, it means all of the cards are exactly the same thickness, they all have exactly the same back on them, they are designed to be played as a unit. But like I said before, when you sit down at a table, if you have a proxy deck, or a deck with proxies in it, let the table know. Because I think one of the impacts of using proxies at the table that isn't discussed quite so much is the way that it changes the power level of your metagame. When you remove the barrier to expensive cards, as much as I like to say Magic isn't entirely pay to win, a lot of those really powerful cards are quite expensive. And when you can move them in and out freely, you are going to be much more dynamic in your ability to respond to the metagame and tinker with your deck to increase the power level dramatically than somebody who's bound by the power of their wallet. So if you do play with proxies, just keep that in mind. Be honest about the power level of your deck. And just because you swapped out a couple of cards doesn't mean you haven't bumped that power level up dramatically. And I'm especially talking about the land base. Just a suite of fetch lands and dual lands goes a long way to making that 3-color deck significantly more consistent and significantly more powerful, even though the cards themselves that you're casting haven't been upgraded at all. Just something to think about when you are putting proxies into your deck and when you are designing your own proxies. I would love to hear what your experiences have been, because I know I've seen nightmare stories of people deciding that they want to give it a shot proxying cards, and all of a sudden they're basically playing CEDH. And it's very difficult to go back once you've upgraded to that point. In just a few weeks, I'm actually going to be at MagicCon Las Vegas. And if you do see me there, come up and say hi, because I have a couple proxies that I'll be handing out. Some with art done by Ashley and a couple others with art done by Bowden. So they're all custom printed, they're pretty nice, and they have all my social stuff on the back. So just a way to give back, say hey, and meet some really cool people. So I look forward to seeing you there, and I look forward to hearing what your experiences have been with the increase in the prevalence of proxy cards in Magic the Gathering. It's been nice talking to you.